Third time lucky. Good afternoon, everyone. I did it. If you could please take your seats so we can begin our panel discussion. It's a wonderful format, actually, having 360 degrees vision, so we can see your contemplating looks from all around the room. There's nowhere to hide. The panel today is going to be about trade in the digital age. We're living in a world today, and if any of you watched the economic outlook discussion we had earlier on, a lot of the themes were about deglobalization today. Insofar as the trade war has impacted the global economy, it's led to a slowdown in many economies that are exposed. But today the theme for this panel is a little bit different, because even though we're seeing a decent amount of opposition to free trade agreements, a move to reshoring, trade of goods and services are facing headwinds, and from that perspective you could say that the world is deglobalizing. When you think about the transfer of data and digital trades, actually things are going in the opposite direction. Things are actually picking up. The McKinsey Global Institute reports that movement of data is actually surpassing traditional physical trade now. There's more trade going on in data than there is with physical goods and services. Data is the oil of the economies, but perhaps now it's also the oil of globalization too. So we're going to be discussing all of these themes in today's panel. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to have you stand up because I'm standing up as well. First up, we have Marcelo Guaranis, the Vice Minister of the Economy of Brazil. It's great to have you with us, sir.
Great to be here.
And then we have none other than Ulrik Vestergaard Knudsen, the former Permanent Secretary of State of Denmark's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD. And then we have Sandra Wachter, who is the Associate Professor of Data Ethics, Artificial Intelligence, Robotics, Internet Regulation, all that fun stuff from Oxford Internet Institute in the UK. And then we have a missing gentleman here. He will be showing up at some point, just so you know who he is if he does show up. He's Naushad Forbes, the past president, Confederation of the Indian Industries. So when he shows up, hopefully he can join our discussion as well. And with that, I'm just going to sit down. It makes my job a little bit easier. If you want to participate, as ever, you can use the Bcast app. I'll be looking at questions and sorting through them as the panel continues. So I'll be keeping an eye on that. And then also the same hashtag you've been using all day. Hopefully you've been using it. It's hashtag OECD Forum or Forum OCDE if you're using the French ones. And you can also engage with @OECD as well. Okay, without much further ado. Ulrik, I'd like to start with you. When you think about digital technologies today and digital trade, which is essentially what this panel is about, is it fair to say that one of the immediate effects of having this globalization of digital trade is that it's led to a reduction in costs?
I think that's reasonable to say, and if it hasn't led to a big reduction in cost, there's certainly a great potential there. And I think it's also interesting perhaps to note from the outset of this discussion when we are talking about trade in the digital age, that this is sort of where the two mega trends fueling growth, supposed to fuel growth in our time and age, namely globalization and digitalization, come together. And I think in many ways you can compare the two in the sense that if we are to create growth, also if we are to create equal growth, we need to embrace both of them. But in order to be able to politically embrace both globalization, digitalization, we also have to be mindful about the distribution of the benefits from the two. Here at the OECD, we have absolutely no doubt that there are overall benefits to be had from globalization. There are certainly benefits to be had from digitalization. So there's not really a choice whether we go for it or not. It's how we go for it. And there, of course, digital trade becomes extremely interesting because it takes place in the interface between, and I think it holds a lot of potential. And I also think if you look at what you call deglobalization, we can see that in the numbers coming out of on world trade, but we can also see that the WTO has not been especially successful over the last 2.5 decades in concluding any rounds. So where is the hope to come from in terms of trade? That's actually trade liberalization. That's actually also on the negotiations on e-commerce that just started at the WTO. They call it e-commerce. Here at the OECD we call it digital trade, but it's basically the same thing. I think that's perhaps an important way to begin this discussion.
Vice Minister, I'd like to ask you, from your perspective, is my mic working? So switching to you, I started off by talking about this wave of deglobalization that's taking place and the triumph right now of the sentiment towards economic nationalism that's taking place in goods and services. Your country has a new administration in place who tend to be of the view that economic nationalism is what is best for your country. How do you think about trade and e-commerce within that context?
Well, actually, as you said, we have a new government in Brazil, but the economic policy that we are trying to implement is now a more liberal economic policy. In Brazil, is a very closed country. We have low levels of imports and exports with all countries, and we understand that we need to open the economy to start having more development. We need development. We need to growth. So the main platform that we have is obviously we need to try to have more equilibrium of fiscal situation that we have in Brazil. So the main reform that we're doing right now is the social security reform, but together with a huge plan of starting and increasing our productivity and competitiveness in order to be able to open our economy. Digital economy in Brazil is still beginning. We're still trying to put together all the different efforts that we have in the government so we can deal better in increasing the level of digital economy. But Brazilians we are a very digital society. People are really into social medias and e-commerce and all kind of connective message applications. So people are always in WhatsApp. And in the conference that we were together 2 years ago, we have the numbers explaining how Brazil, I think, is the second or the third one more connected country in the world. But it is still not something that's linked to our economy. It's how to make our economy more digital or how to make public policies boost the level of digital economy that we have.
Can I just ask, is your approach one where you want to open up so that external technologies can come in, or is it one where you're trying to encourage local technologies to become more competitive? And if so, where do you draw the line between opening up the barriers, but at the same time also supporting your local industry?
It's an important question. The beginning of the process of opening the economy that we are setting right now is starting with the IT goods and capital goods. So we want to attack the inputs so we can give our industry the capacity to increase their productivity before opening the rest of the economy. And it's very important. Brazil has had a lot of protection throughout the times, and the last years it increased the level of protection. And we understand that the level of tariffs that we practice in Brazil is too high compared to the level of the OECD countries. Talking about IT goods and capital goods, the average of OECD countries is 4%, and in Brazil is 14%. So we are now trying to start a trajectory of decreasing the level of these tariffs in 4 years, 3 years, so we can start having the level of competitiveness of our industry. Important to do this together with the tax reform. Brazil has a very complex tax system, and we understand this is something that makes more difficult to do business in Brazil. And one of the things that people were more protective in Brazil is because they understand the tax system is complex, so they don't want to open our economy if we don't have a simple tax system. The plan is to do everything together right now.
Actually have the right infrastructure in place. So we've talked about the freedom of movement of information, but Sandra, before we came on here, you did warn me that you're a lawyer by training, so you're going to pick holes in a lot of these arguments. What would you say is the major concern about this free passage, the free movement of data cross borders in a way that isn't necessarily regulated as efficiently as it should be?
Yeah, I think everybody's talking about the amazing opportunities, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm usually the person that tells you, but there are also problems, ethical considerations that we have to take into account. And with the massive flow of data and data being shared with so many different parties, obviously privacy is one of the biggest concerns that we have. As you said, technology doesn't really care about geography. So figuring out how we can meaningfully protect privacy in the 21st century in a globalized society is one of the biggest challenges that we have from an ethical and normative perspective, and there is no clear answer yet. We have in Europe new regulation now, but some people already say that this regulation is not sufficient, it might be out of date. Even though it's the best standard that we have right now. And I think it's very important that we think about those things, because privacy is such an important, it's a human right. It's a human right that is important for the individual, it's important for society, and we have to think of more creative ways to protect privacy without stifling innovation. And that's one of the biggest tasks that we have right now.
Do you see that there's a conflict between digital trade and privacy?
I don't think there's a conflict, but there's a balance to be struck for sure. And even if I'm not a lawyer, my warning to the panel is that I'm an economist. So I tend to look at this from the free trade side of things, that we have to do away with the restrictions to trade. But of course, we have to recognize that some of the things that the newly appointed professor mentioned, privacy and security, these are of course legitimate concerns when we talk about regulating cross-border data flow. But it's also important that that countries do not hide behind regulation for the purpose of developing domestic capacities. That is sort of the digital trade equivalent of old-time protectionism or tariff or an import substitution strategy, where you want to protect sort of an infant industry maybe in order to develop it economically. And that we are not too keen on.
How would you distinguish between the two? Because as you say, barriers to digital trades can come from many different angles. And as you say, in some cases it is warranted from a privacy perspective, and in other cases it's not. And it could be just another form of protectionism. So where do you draw the line? How do you draw the line? And a question I'd like to ask you as well, Professor.
But that, of course, is extremely difficult. It says also in the WTO rules, it's stipulated that a legitimate concern is national security. And now we've seen over the past year or so that the American administration has from time to time used national security concerns when it comes to, for example, arguing for tariffs on cars or steel or something like that. Is it a national security concern or not? It depends on how you define national security. It has to be a very soft definition of national security, I think, for it to be interpreted in that way. But I'll leave that to the lawyers.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I think the way that we currently do it is we very often use consent, basically giving it up to the individual to decide if he or she wants to share their data. And that makes sense, because then you have on paper you were consented to it, so it must be okay. But just because you consent to something doesn't mean it's ethical. And that's something that poses a problem, because if I'm honest, I don't know how many people actually read the terms and conditions, except for me. Most people don't have the time, the energy to go through all of that. They just want to use a service, and they're not really aware of what they're giving up. They're not really aware of the possible consequences of data sharing. And maybe it's more time to think about ethical responsibilities of the people who collect the data and what they're using it for. And at the moment, we just have this barrier to say, well, you consented, and everything that happens afterwards, that's out of your control. Maybe it's more time to think about, fiduciary duties of companies, because if you have a lot of data, you have a lot of responsibility. And I think that's probably beneficial. I think it will also be beneficial to be more transparent. I think people will be more likely to give their data away if they understand what's in it for them. Most of the time you just consent to it because you want to use a service, but you actually don't know what's in it for it, right? There are interesting studies, especially with health research and cancer research. If you tell people that their data is being used to fight cancer, they're more likely to give it away. And that's a very good, beneficial thing for whole society. And similar things could be tried here, where it's really about, a more contractual partner relationship rather than somebody taking something away in order to, force you to give away the data in order to let you use that service. I think it should be more on a eye-to-eye basis. That makes sense.
You're giving power back to the individual, essentially. Speaking of access and global access, Minister, I'd like to ask you, actually, this is a question from the audience as well, which ties into one of my own. What are the key barriers for small and micro companies engaged in digital trade cross-border? Is it data localization and different data protection requirements, or is it issues related to IPR, cybersecurity, etc.? So to rephrase the question, what do you do when international technology is incompatible with local laws?
Wow.
Discuss.
I'm glad you got that one.
Yeah, oh my God. Well, I may have advantage and maybe a problem because I'm a lawyer and I'm an economist, so I can try to deal with both sides. First of all, just going back a little bit with the former discussion that we were having, I think everybody in the world is facing the problem of how to regulate. And regulation is always the same, independently of the sector it is. How to set the right level of regulation is very important to not inhibit the innovation and at the same time protect what is the market failures that you have to deal with. So it was also an interesting debate in Brazil following what was happening in Europe and US, but I think our legislator preferred to follow what's happening in Europe. And the discussion that we have is this, together with the question that you're doing. By the end of the day, the legal framework that we have may have some problems with competition because the SMEs, the small medium enterprise, will have to deal with some obligations that will be hard for them. During the legislative procedure, this is something that we are trying to discuss with the Congress because we understand that all the major companies would like to have like the most protective data system and data law, but sometimes it's a problem with competition. And in Brazil, we need to increase competition. We need to give incentives to the small and medium enterprise that we are being created in Brazil. It's so hard for them to start because of all the tax system that we have, but we need to try to eliminate all the barriers that they have. So by the end of the day, I think our regulation is not so competitiveness oriented as we want this to be. This was a discussion at the Congress. What's the balance? What can we do? Yeah. Well, I think every time we are dealing with technology, like what was telecommunication in Brazil, all over the world, you cannot be too hard or too restrictive in regulation because you have to allow the incentives to innovation. We don't know what will be the next step. We don't know what technology will bring. So it's difficult to foresee, and regulation is always something that we're trying to predict what will be the next behavior. So I think the balance is to keep it minimum. We were not able to do this in Brazil, but we're still beginning. The legislation is not in place. It will start only in the beginning of 2020. We are now setting the authority, trying to create and elaborate the authority, and it will also be a key thing to understand how all this legislation will be implemented and how we will be able to incentive innovation.
Legislation is very important here, and all four of us have said the word regulation multiple times in the last 20 minutes or so. Do you think that the current legislative framework actually works insofar as it's containing privacy concerns, but at the same time allowing these companies to prosper? And also, do you think it perhaps is a little bit biased towards the bigger tech companies that continue to thrive in this environment and continue to gain market share at the expense of some of the smaller players?
I think you're right. I think it does favor the bigger players, and I think that it is becoming more complex. We have tried here at the OECD to gather data on various approaches to cross-border data flows, because this is, of course, so important to digital trade. And what we find is that basically you can divide regulatory frameworks around the world into four main categories. There is one category where there's almost no regulation. And that does not necessarily mean that it's a free-flowing market. It's actually not necessarily a good thing, because people and countries and companies are not likely to send their data to countries where there's absolutely no regulation at all. And this is what we often see, for example, in least developed countries. Then there's another approach that we call ex-ante regulation. It means that we say beforehand that to this and that country you can send your data, no problem. Then there's another approach called ex-post accountability. which sort of, so the other one was ex ante regulation, where you say beforehand that to these and these countries it's okay to send your data. Then there's ex post accountability, where you say you can do whatever you like, but you're responsible for any misuse of the data once it reaches that country. So that's the ex post version. And then the final one is the case-by-case basis, which is often an approach we see in countries where the state has a very strong role in regulating society, perhaps not that widespread in OECD-like democracies. But this is the case-by-case basis, where you almost have to have sort of an approval before you send any data. I don't think, given the political ideologies underpinning these approaches, that it's possible to go to the WTO or the OECD and say we want a full harmonization of this. It's not going to happen. But what would be beneficial to digital trade is if there was some sort of interoperability between these 4 different domains. It's important for digital trade, but it's really a mirror of perhaps even an even bigger issue facing the world, basically, in the sense that when these countries look differently upon data, if you ask around the world who owns our data, you will find some parts of the world they say, well, the market owns it. It's the companies that own them first when you first given it to them. Others, and I think you're right, Professor, in saying this is not least in Europe. We say no, it's the individual. We have to protect the individual. Other places it'll be the state or perhaps even the party. And then again, there's the 4th domain, where perhaps least developed countries will be saying, we know you talk about data, but we don't have them collected. We're not quite sure what this discussion is about because we don't have them readily readable.
What do you do in a situation, and we're witnessing one of this now, the last couple of days, and I mentioned this on an earlier panel, it appears as though some elements of the trade war have moved towards a tech war. And increasingly, we're seeing barriers go up within tech space as well, targeting specific companies. When you think about it from a governmental perspective, some of those will fall into, say, the 4th category, where there's clearly a state that is behind some of the flows and the user information that is being processed without a lot of accountability at an international level. So when you think about what you were saying and your aspirations for Brazil, the transformation of Brazil, how do you balance between the two? Because on one hand, it's easy, it's accessible, it's perhaps more cost efficient to take up technology that's there for you. But on the other hand, there are some real national security concerns that are being flagged by many countries around the world.
Difficult? Well, it's always a trade-off. I think that we have in Brazil some initiatives to try to develop our own technology and try to heavily protect our data, and some regulations are still in place. But we understand that it was not the right way, so we can have a digital economy, or to develop the country the way we want to have. So I think now the debate, how can we balance that? I think that the information that you mentioned from this week, it will be very important on the debate, so we can understand. It's something that we can, not be in our hands, our information, our data, our system. We can rely on the country to have everything that is basic for our development. I think it's something that's really on the debate. I really don't have the right answer right now, but I still think that it's important to keep an open regulation. We cannot use this kind of event to try to restrict everything. I think that our legislation on data protection was very. It was a huge influence of the problems that Facebook had like 2 years ago. And it was in the middle of the debate of the parliament, and it was a huge contamination. And sometimes when you're in the heat of the moment, it's not the best way to have regulation. So I think we have to wait a little bit to see what will be the effects of this movement.
It's interesting, in the context of regulation, it's not just about each country themselves setting aside their own regulation. You need to have global cooperation on that front. Sandra, question to you. Are ethics universally applicable? And the reason I ask that is because intertwined with regulation is ethics and what each country values as important. How do you reconcile that?
I don't know, and nobody does, to be fair. I also think that maybe ethics is not something that is to be reconciled. Maybe ethics is not there to be coherent. Maybe ethics is something that changes over time, changes between countries and culture, and is something that constantly have to be updated. Ethics is not just a big box-taking exercise. I was like, yeah, I'm done with the ethics now. I can do the other thing that is not ethical. It's really, it's an iterative process, and you have to think about the actions that you do every day and figure out if you're still in the maxim of what you think. Ethics is not supposed to be easy, and ethics is also not cheap. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we face right now, that finding a solution on this when there are different notions of ethics, what's valuable, why we want technology, what's the main purpose of it, who do we want to benefit, who, you know, what's behind all of this. Figuring out an answer won't be easy, and I don't think there will be one, because it's just something, it's an iterative process.
Global cooperation must be quite tricky then.
Global cooperation is very tricky. It is, and global cooperation is particularly tricky right now, where we see some structural shifts with the geopolitics perhaps very much back playing a central role in what goes on in the multilateral institutions. This happens, unfortunately, you could say, at a time where we're confronted with unprecedented change and unprecedented complexity of issues at the global level: migration, climate change, terrorism, in some countries aging, and also a perception that the benefits of globalization, digitalization, are perhaps not evenly distributed. This then causes, in many countries, political reactions like nationalism and populism, and lots of good can probably be said about that to a certain extent, but it is also true that nationalism can stand in the way of international cooperation, which we are working for here at the OECD, and populism can stand in the way of actually choosing the right and sometimes complex solutions to problems, and not always the simple ones, which is also a watermark of what we do here at the OECD. We try to help countries find the right solutions, inspire each other with best practices. So some of the causes of globalization and digitalization are seen in these political reactions that are not necessarily helpful in harnessing international cooperation. And this is sort of a bad circle, because if we are not able to cooperate internationally, we cannot solve the climate crisis. We cannot solve the issues of migration and terrorism and so on. And we can probably not either work together on a more narrow issue like this one, on digital trade, finding the right regimes, finding, if not harmonization, then interoperability. So international cooperation is really a key word here.
We had a question asking, is it possible to develop a data protection framework to suit all? And I think by just listening to all of you, I think the answer to that would be probably it's very difficult.
Yeah, it will be very difficult. I mean, we do have a kind of a trial version right now, if you want to say that, because we have the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe now, which binds all the member states in the European Union. But the interesting part about that framework is that it also goes beyond the borders of Europe. So if a third-party country wants to target the European market, they have to adhere to those standards as well. If you want to transfer data outside of Europe to a third-party country, the same standards have to be upheld. So it will be interesting to see in the future years how jurisprudence, how case law evolves around that, what kind of business effects that have, how the economy responds to that, because it's interesting to have a framework that actually has, jurisdiction outside its natural jurisdiction. And I think that will give us a good understanding if we can move towards something that is internationally recognized. It's interesting, if you look at a lot of countries that are outside the European Union, they're starting to draft laws that mimic the GDPR because they want to be compatible with the European market. So you see that, phrases from the right to be forgotten, for example, appear in other frameworks now, right? So there might be something that we're working towards, a more coherent and standardized version of data protection, and we will see in the coming years how it works out.
This leads nicely to another question that I just saw here from Tobias Rossi, so thank you. Will big tech ever reach a level of mutually assured self-regulation? I think that's a really interesting point because you hear the likes of Mark Zuckerberg saying now, in the last couple of months, we need more regulation in our industry, which is very interesting coming from a company that obviously has been rocked from scandal to scandal. Similar sounds are coming out from other large social media companies as well. Twitter, obviously, whose platform has been used multiple times. As a government, if you have a big tech company coming in and saying, don't worry about us, we're self-regulated, how are you going to respond to that?
I will respond, let's see. Well,
Politician.
Brazil has, I think, a terrible tradition of heavily regulate every sector. When you go to the World Economic Forum Index for Competitiveness, we are, I think, in the 136 of 137 in heavy regulation, in government regulation. So in Brazil, the answer would be no, we will regulate. What we're trying to change is that, well, just now, have a new law on explaining, before regulating, we have to think about that. It's common in every European developed country and in the US to try to make a better regulatory analysis before regulating, but it was not in our culture, and we have a lot of heavy regulation that we understand that we do not have to work with that anymore. But I think from now on, we have to think about that. And specifically on this case, well, we already have some regulatory framework for deal with big tech companies. So what we have to do now is to follow if the regulatory framework that we have is really helping us to develop and to bring competition to the market.
What's your view on self-regulation?
Of course, we can't rely on any big companies, not that big tech companies either, to self-regulate. I think that is obvious. And this is not to take part in any witch hunt against these companies. They have offered us the opportunity to have the whole world at our fingertips. So they have so much on offer, and they are so much a part of the benefits from digitalization that we will have to harness. But I think they have come themselves to the realization, and I can't speak on behalf of them, but my impression is that they have come to the realization also that regulation is needed, and perhaps for them, rather than to be regulated in a very defensive environment, perhaps also proactively put themselves out in the arena, state their mission and their vision, and take part in the discussion about how they should be regulated. One important aspect of this is, of course, the tax aspect, which is maybe, at least by way of negotiations and standard setting, maybe that's the most important thing going on at the OECD at the moment, the discussions on digital taxation, which has this issue at its center.
That was actually going to be my follow-up question on whether the tax environment has adequately progressed to reflect this current technology environment that we live in, where you've got a handful of big tech firms making a vast amount of profits and not being taxed proportionately to, say, your traditional bricks and mortar company. Where do the OECD stand right now on digital taxation?
The tax systems obviously have not kept pace with developments. This is why we're having this discussion. But this is also why we think that there is actually a pretty good chance that we will deliver on our promise to have some sort of taxation regime agreed to next year, 2020. That is the deadline that we have set before us. It may seem like a daunting task to have a multilateral negotiation involving assets and funds and economic means of this magnitude be solved within a year. That is not normally the way it works in the UN or the WTO. But I think when we still have a shot at it here, it's because that the alternative is I had one bilateral talk today actually with one of the tech companies. Said the alternative is chaos. The alternative is that all the countries will go at these big tech companies one by one because they will no longer accept that they have their tax base eroded. So the alternative is chaos, and when the alternative is chaos, you have a better shot at reaching consensus even in very difficult negotiations.
Essentially, the goal is to get to some form of streamlined digital taxation for these big tech companies. So then where do you draw the line? At what how do you create the scorecard of taxation between, the little guy in Brazil who's trying to compete on an international scale versus the already, more mature digital companies?
I think there are at least two reasons why it would be unwise of me to answer that question. One is I don't know the answer, and the second is that if I knew, it would probably be politically controversial and not the right time for me to speculate about it in public.
Fair enough. All right, we have another question from the audience. Given the global challenges and concerns of who will benefit from the digital trade, digital divide, how important will the development agenda be in the discussions on global e-commerce? Minister, I'm going to ask this question to you. Just to repeat, given the challenges and concerns of who will benefit from digital trade, how important is the agenda of advancing global e-commerce?
I think it goes to the need to harmonization, to have benefits to development of everybody. You have to try to harmonize the way we deal with data and the way we deal with e-commerce. If we have a lot of restrictions, we won't have the same benefits to all different countries. The different countries are in different levels of development. So I think that the kind of discussion that we're doing here in OECD, I think OECD is the best forum to discuss this, and the forum that I know that's most developed discussing this issue. It's a good start.
Sanjay, we spent a lot of time talking about the commerce companies, the social media companies. We haven't talked a lot about the new types of technology, and here I'm talking about artificial intelligence, robotics. You've done a lot of work on that topic. Where does that fit in to all of this discussion, again, from a data privacy standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, every country that has a flag at the moment is publishing their new strategies on how to use AI in the next years. So AI is really on the political agenda of almost every country. So I think the importance of the technology cannot be overstated at the moment. I think one of the main problems will be, it's probably, with any technology, it depends how we deploy it, right? It could make things better, it could make things worse. It's a tool, it really depends on the hands that use it. I think one of the problems that we might face with artificial intelligence, probably from a privacy and human rights perspective, would be what algorithms are able to learn about individuals, right? At the moment when I'm giving consent, I have, at least an idea of what data I'm assigning away. I'm giving my email address, I'm giving my age, I'm giving my name. Artificial intelligence is able to infer so much more about me without me knowing. So they could infer my sexual orientation, my ethnicity, my political affiliation, and use that for purposes that I have no idea. So I guess it's could be more problematic in terms of privacy. It could also reinforce stereotypes and increase bias that we already have in the world, because obviously AI is learning from historical data. It's trying to find better patterns in historical data and learns from it. And the data is biased because the world is biased. So all the bad decisions are mirrored in our data and are probably going to be reflected in the future. So we can exacerbate and reinforce the stereotypes that we already have. So trying to use the technology for good purposes is fine, but we have to keep in mind that certain things could be exacerbated.
I know I asked you a tricky question earlier, but I want to go back to the taxation point on how you think about taxing different companies. It's not an easy question. I know it's not an easy question, but do you think there's something to be said for perhaps the companies that rely more on algorithms and more on extracting user data, personal data, big data? There's an argument for them to be taxed at a higher level because you're giving up more data than other companies.
Yeah, it's a fantastic, interesting point. If you break it down to what the essence of law and ethics actually are, the essence is you want to create parity, you want to create equality, you want to create equal opportunity. And equal opportunity also means having the same shot at entering the market, fair competition, for example. So thinking about having a higher burden for companies who have the resources and the market power and the data resources to do that kind of stuff has been discussed. If you look, for example, at the European Union, there were a couple of proposals in the last years that talked about whether we need new regulation regarding smart robotics and artificial intelligence. And some of them were saying, oh, we should have a robot tax or an AI tax, actually. They also said that we should consider whether universal basic income is an idea of, for example, helping the uncertainty of displacing the workforce. The discussion didn't really go that far because when it actually came to vote, those provisions were taken out of the resolution. So we actually don't know. It's usually a topic that is, it's the elephant in the room that nobody really wants to discuss. Nobody wants to really talk about it, but I think it's quite interesting. I mean, it sounds very trivial, but if you have more power, if you have more data, if you have more ability to do something that is potentially harmful to society, maybe you should have more responsibilities as well.
Somebody raised a very interesting point in the audience. Do we need more consistency in data governance and the recording of data? So if you're working on the assumption that there's this data coming out from everywhere, from all angles, but it's being recorded differently, surely that presents some issues as well. Are you thinking of introducing legislation that streamlines the way the data is recorded and, as a consequence of that, the way it's governed?
That was for the Brazilian minister. I have to say this falls a little bit outside my portfolio here at the OECD. I'm pretty sure that we do some work on this. What I can say in a closely related topic concerning both cross-border data flows and artificial intelligence, we are trying to make data hubs here at the OECD where we gather data, where we gather evidence in order to make analysis that we then make available to member countries, specifically on artificial intelligence. This is not exactly what you're asking about, but it's kind of similar. We are hoping to open up an AI observatory at the end of this year, where we will ask not only member countries, also other countries, and academia, NGOs, companies, to come with their data on artificial intelligence, and we will make a hub here in order for everyone sort of to be able to enjoy access to that and also to enjoy the benefits of common analysis and evidence-based analysis.
You just reminded me that I've steered this conversation very heavily towards taxation and regulation. Let's talk about the upside of digital trade. And to go back to what I was saying right at the very beginning, we are living in a world where global trade is contracting. If you look at trade of services, goods, it has been contracting. How much of an opportunity and how much upside do you see really from investing in digital trade here? How much of a productivity opportunity do you see it as?
I think a lot. Well, I think that the beauty of this digital economy and all this connectivity that we have right now is to put together different actors that wouldn't have this opportunity if they didn't have this environment. So even our city, when you see some people, I think everybody here knows Uber Eats. I expect this ahead in Europe. In Brazil, we have iFood. Everybody buy with application. Well, there's sometimes some restaurant that you didn't know even that it exists, and now you are like buying from them. So they have a lot of new opportunities of doing business than they used to have, thinking locally. And I think the same in the world. Now we have a totally different number of suppliers throughout the world that have opportunity and have access to other kind of markets. And I think this is fantastic. This increases productivity, this increases competitiveness, and this increases competition throughout the world. Now we are competing with some supplier in the other part of the world that you didn't even know it would exist. So you have to be aware of that. I think this is fantastic.
Just in terms of the challenge for Brazil, what would you say is the number one challenge in terms of adopting and becoming more up to speed with the digital trade and where it is with the rest of the world?
I think open economy is one of the things that's most important. I think, again, as I mentioned in my first answer, we are a very close country. So this is culturally difficult because every time, everybody's in favor of opening the economy, but every time it's in your backyard, you don't want it to be open. So it's difficult to negotiate with the Brazilian society. We are right now discussing the multilateral agreement with the European Union, in Mercosur, that's Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Paraguay. And everybody is is in favor, but we can't move because there's always some sector that is strongly against and political influence, that has political influence, and it's difficult to move. I think it's how can we convince the society of all the benefits? They know, but we have to translate to them. This is very important. I think open economy is the first challenge that we have to deal.
I think, Minister Marcelo, I think, if I may, we've met before and we had so much trouble pronouncing each other's names, so we were on a first name basis. But I think, Marcelo, there's a much easier answer to the question raised here: how can Brazil achieve all of these difficult objectives? And the short answer is become a member of the OECD. And this is less provocative than it sounds, because I know it is the ambition also of your government. But there is some truth in it, in the sense that you are already living up to many more standards than any of the other prospective accession countries, and of course this is actually a pathway to opening up your economy, and certainly we stand ready to help you.
We're making history happen in this panel. Sanjay, can I have some closing remarks from you on, we've talked a lot about the opportunity of digital trade, we've talked about some of the drawbacks as well, and some of the challenges. What would you say, again, digging into your background and your expertise, are the main things we need to be mindful of when thinking about the blossoming of this business?
Yeah, I think about ethical responsibility should be the key concern, because those technologies and big data is just so powerful. Even though I'm a lawyer, I don't necessarily think that regulation is the answer to everything. I think the question of whether self-regulation or hard regulation is not the correct one. It's the question of, it's both very good tools, it depends on the context. There are certain times where I think self-regulation is preferable. For example, because the company knows itself, has the resources, the expertise, and all of that. And sometimes regulation is not being made proactively, it's being made reactively. I've got asked a question a couple of years back: how do legislators decide what to regulate? And they basically said, well, the newspapers dictate that. And that's true. There's a big scandal, there's public outcry, and then very often regulators, because they have to rush in and fix it quickly. And very often that kind of regulation is not very well thought out. It's maybe not fit for purpose, it's maybe not actually grasping the root of the problem, but it's just an easy fix. And in those times, I don't think that the hard regulation is a good way. In those kind of instances, probably soft regulation is better. And in soft regulation, the only thing that I would caution is that it's fine if you self-regulate. The question is, how do I know that you follow those rules, and what happens if you don't? And if you have good answers to both those questions, self-regulation can work very well. It's more agile, it makes more sense. It's really just about how can I foster trust with other companies, with my customers, to show this is my ethical value, this is how I'm going to protect it, and this is how you can count on me. And in those kind of situations, I think it would be then you actually have trustworthy companies, and that will also increase the business relationships with their customers.
Makes the job a little bit easier. And to your point, Minister, you were saying earlier, you can't rush into these decisions. You can't be reactive about legislating. It has to come from a place, a very well thought out place to begin with. Ulrich, I'd like to end on you on a positive note. Talk to us about the opportunities presented by digital trade before I open this up to Q&A.
But I will end on a positive note by congratulating you, moderator, with having spurred two historic events here today, because the second one is for you to have a lawyer admit that regulation is not necessarily always the answer. I think that is a historic achievement, so that was twice in an hour. But I will end on the positive note, saying that we should not, of course, lose sight of the huge potential that there is to digital trade here. This must be the starting point for any discussion, and I think that every concern that even the lawyers have brought into this, ethical, privacy, security, they're very legitimate concerns, and we need, as I said in the beginning, to strike a balance. But of course, this is against the background that there is a huge potential here for digital trade. This can revolutionize the way we deal with each other, we trade with each other, the way data and also goods pass through borders, because sometimes these transactions are actually a mix of data and services, and in the end, the smartphone, if you like, will end up in your pocket. So it's extremely complex. So we need to tackle it within a reformed multilateral trading system. That would be my ending point.
Excellent. All right, let's open up for questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? So, yeah.
Hi, I'm a compliance specialist in HSBC. I'm specialized in sanction compliance and AML and all compliance stuff. So my question is for you. I think you own a company, if I'm not wrong, for the participant. Okay.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, you were saying that regulation prevents trade from success. In my opinion, I mean, regulation is an asset for trade and for business, because I mean it gives you reputational impact among your, in the competition world. If you are more regulated and you have more, I mean, you have a risk mapping inside your company, and you are preventing from corruption, tax evasion, AML, CFT, etc. And you have less, settlement with the U.S. Department of Justice and so on, and you don't have exposure with Iran and sanctioned countries. Then you are more valuable for the market, and then you can satisfy your investors and shareholders. Even it's, I mean, it's a confidence for the consumers. This is my opinion. For me, regulation is an asset, a value for the market and the business, and it gives transparency to the market, the business, companies, and we have more confidence in the business and in the market. So for me, regulation is a positive thing, and we need to go for more regulation, effective regulation inside multinationals and companies. I don't know what you think about this.
I think this was directed to the non-company owner. No, I actually think we agree perfectly. I think that regulation for legitimate reasons is certainly an asset, that this is what we do at the OECD. This is what I'm praising also at the multilateral level, that we need regulation to have a level playing field, so we play by the same rules. So in that sense, regulation, regimes, standard settings is certainly a force for good. I think maybe where I was misunderstood was when I said that there are also, in some cases, grounds for regulations that are not valid if you want to protect a domestic capacity at the expense of the international trading system or the international rules, if you're sort of trying to cheat the rules, if you like. That was my point, and certainly not an all-out attack on regulation. We live from regulation at this organization.
May I help just a second? It's a case of good regulation is good. Not all regulation. There are a lot of regulation that is not good. That's the point. And if you have good regulation, it's important to have stability for the business environment. So you know the rules. But you have a bad regulation with barriers to competition, it won't be good to you unless you are the one that's already in the market.
I think the difference is, you mentioned that you work for a bank, and if you think about the banking industry, the regulation is very streamlined across the board. So what applies to one US bank applies to another US bank because of Dodd-Frank, because of Volcker Rule, because of all of these new regulations that came out post-crisis. Tech is in a different phase when it comes to adopting this regulation. There isn't one size fits all right now, because there are different types of tech companies, different types of digital companies, and what applies to banks universally may not necessarily apply to the small tech company that's operating in a developing country versus say an Amazon or a Facebook. And I think that's the challenge. The challenge is to create something that gives the rubber stamp, as what you were looking for, that gold seal of approval, and that it's passing the regulation test, but at the same time it's streamlined. And it's very difficult when you have all of these different types of technology companies. Is there anything you'd like to add, Sandra?
I think you're touching on something that is very important. banking industry, like we have banks like forever. We know what the risks are. We know what discrimination occurred in that environment. With AI, for example, or big data in general, there's not just one business model. It's not just banking, it's also advertisement, it's health, it's criminal justice, it's insurance, it's basically anything. It's so agile, it could be used in every sector across the board. So having like one framework, be it soft or hard regulation that applies to all AI and all big data equally, doesn't really make sense, because if you're an advertising company, you have different risks, different interests, different problems than you have if you're developing software for predictive policing, for example, different things, even though the technology is similar. So I think it really has to, good regulation, be it soft or hard, really has to focus on the context and the actual application and take it from there, if that makes sense.
My name is Palash. I'm representing Young Diplomats of Canada. So we have been talking a lot about digital divide in people. So I wanted to ask, digitalization in trade, do you see that impacts trade deficit in countries, in between countries, positively, negatively? How do you see that happening?
So just to rephrase the question, the impact digital trades will have on the country's overall deficit.
Right. In
So
export and
current
import,
account,
I think,
essentially current account from income.
Yes. So I mean, in between countries, do you see that creates more? So, for example, if a country which is technologically advanced in trade, they might have an upper hand. How do you see that's happening in export and import because of the digital divide?
Well, I think it's pretty difficult to foresee. I think that as we are trying to, it's digital trade will bring a lot of innovation and again a lot of competition. I think the beauty of the competition is that you never know what's going to happen because it brings innovation. So maybe if you take the situation that we are right now, or the level of commerce that the countries have among them right now, you may think that we will have some deficit, thinking about, well, Brazil in Europe, but it will open so many new opportunities that we don't know how it's gonna behave after that. So it's very, very difficult to know. I think the problem of obviously not your question, but this kind of argument to try to maybe protect the country of trade, digital trade, is to not allow us to have all the benefits that we can have from this new world. It's very difficult to foresee how relationship will happen after this revolution.
Has the OECD done any work on the impact digital trades could have on various imbalances in the world?
Oh, I agree with the Brazilian minister on this one. First of all, we would not want to measure the success of a digital trade regime in terms of whether people came out or countries came out with a trade deficit or not. Secondly, it would be almost impossible to predict, also because of the global value chains that are becoming so complex. So if trade is opened up digitally, it is very difficult to foresee where on this global value chain which countries would actually benefit. The truth of the matter is that both countries exporting and importing are benefiting from trade, and that also goes for digital trade. It is not a zero-sum game, it's a plus-sum game, and actually most trade theory would point to the fact that contrary to one would think when you hear politicians talking about trade, no offense, Minister, but you would think that imports are bad and exports are good. It's actually the opposite, because the lower price of import increases the consumer choice, and it makes the real disposable income of your constituents stronger and higher. And that is a basic fact, very often overlooked when we discuss these things. But it doesn't make it a legitimate question. It's just not the prism that we would see this through, or the lens we would see this through.
You know, he made me think of something else, though. When you talk about classification, how would you classify digital trade? Does it fall under services or does it fall under goods? Because you can make an argument for both.
That is a question that really can't be answered in 2019 anymore.
A lot of those today.
Because it's no, but it's such a good question because again, the example of the smartphone. If you want to buy a smartphone, and also the services you buy on your smartphone. Some of them are certainly not physical goods, some of them are services. Some of them are not even services in the traditional sense. It's just data being sent to your phone from somewhere. You probably don't even know from where. So we are entering an age, and we're entering an issue here where it's almost impossible to divide the physical good from the service transaction, from the flow of data.
Great. Another question?
I should like to ask the opinion of OECD secretariats. As to the validity of the results given by AI, most of the experts I contacted in Japan, they told me that there's no way to verify accuracy of the results of survey made by AI, because they have gone through a lot of metadata, and there's no way for human beings to verify the results given by the AI. So if it is so, how can international trade take place? Trade should be based on market research. Market research is made by AI. So if there are two results on a particular, the area where the marketing is made, negotiators draws different results from their respective AIs. So there's no way for them to make fair trade. This is a fundamental question, put by the experts in Japan on AI. I wonder whether what I'm saying makes sense to you or not. Thank you.
To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by AI results. Is that what you're saying? Cannot be verified? You mean results in terms of policy recommendations, or do you mean services, or do you mean data? I'm not exactly sure what you mean, to be honest. If you could elaborate on.
Well, just one example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a company claims they have made a thorough survey on the likely demands for particular product using the AI techniques. So deep, the learning, is applied. And then our computer got directives from the human beings. So computer have to gather certain information according to that criteria. Then they gave some answer. Product A is much more competitive than the others, etc., etc. But other company will say the contrary, because it's not possible to get into the brain of AIs.
Okay.
How you can compare the results? How?
Okay,
Beyond human control, it becomes very difficult to have a streamlined testing because it's machines making the decisions.
Sure. We got one step further in the second round, because now I understand the question, but I don't have the answer. But I understand the question, and I understand why this is why this is certainly a challenge when you apply AI thinking and you use AI to predict market outcomes, or to predict, if I understand you correctly, what will be the demand for a certain project. And I am not aware of actually any work here at the OECD or elsewhere on that exact issue. And this is maybe also why the Japanese experts are saying that we do not, as a community or as a planet, have an answer right now for that question.
Luckily, we have an expert on the panel with us on AI, Sandra.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and I think it's a question that rarely ever gets asked, because if you try to criticize AI, everybody's just closing their ears and they don't want to hear it. But I think you're putting your finger on something very important, and that's the question of how much can we trust AI and what it's doing. And two things that AI traditionally does, it's predicting something, right? Or it's giving you a recommendation, which is more like an opinion. And both those things cannot be verified at the point when the decision is being made. An opinion can never be verified because it's subjective truth, or it's a subjective opinion, and a prediction cannot or ever be verified. You know, if I'm predicting you're going to default on a loan, I will not know if that actually is correct. So the completely over-reliance on those systems is problematic if you think they're unfallible. One of the reasons is that we don't understand what's going on in the black box. We don't actually know what the algorithm saw, where it found the patterns, what kind of things correlate with something else, why it was significant. The human eye maybe see completely different, interesting patterns that the AI doesn't understand because it works differently. So we need actually more research on understanding why an algorithm came up with something in order to be able to trust the algorithm. Because what we do at the moment is we call it artificial intelligence. Intelligence implies that something is smart. Just because something is complicated doesn't mean it's smart. If I'm asking you a question and you're able to answer it, I'm not going to assume that you're smart. I'm going to test you until you give me a result that I'm satisfied with. And the same is what we should do with algorithms. We should test them until we're satisfied with the answer and believe that what they're saying is actually correct.
Answer. All right, another question?
Better than mine, for sure.
We did have a gentleman over there.
It's good, after all, we have a lawyer on the panel, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm Gerhard Vorwald, and I'm a tax lawyer. We're talking about taxes. And I am working for a non-government organization which is called Close the Gap Worldwide. So we want to close the gap between the very rich and the rest of the world. And there is a model we want to about taxes. It's called the Global Formally Apportionment Model. And I would like your comment of all the three of you about this model. It's very easy to explain. We go and do the income of the multinationals, worldwide income. We make one tax accounting for the world income. And this world income we separate with three factors. 1/3 is given to the countries where they produce, so where the property is, so the factories are. The second third get the countries where the payroll is paid, so where the people are working. And the third part goes to the countries where the products are sold. This means we don't have the problem of tax evasion anymore because it is taxed and everybody gets something. And we just need a minimum tax rate for the competition. And the proposal is we make 15% minimum tax rate. That's the whole model. I mean, it's not a new tax. It's just a question how we get the income divided in the world.
Sounds like a clean solution, Minister.
Well, first of all, I'd like to invite him to come to Brazil because in the middle of discussion the tax reform. And since we are, I think, so late in discussing how to modernize our tax system, it's good because we now have different situations that we can have to consider. And now this digital economy situation and the discussion on how to tax different relationships among the countries and how all the flows of income will happen. I think this is something that we have to deal right now. In Brazil, we have so many taxes that the first thing that we have to do is make them all simpler, unify them, and have a simplification. But we know that the next step will be how can we tax on the new digital economy. Well, talking about your proposal, we have to have numbers and have to think about that. But it makes some sense because the difficulty of that, because we have so many different people in the global value of change now producing and really working and who will buy. So you're trying to see what will be the equilibrium on receiving the revenue of all these flows. It's interesting, but we have to calculate. I'm from the Ministry of Economy, so we have to calculate everything to see if the revenue will be good. So, but I think it's a good idea how to start with.
It sort of ties into the other question, which is, is there a one-size-fits-all model?
I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all model, and thank you for providing a model with clarity, but you cannot imagine the kinds of troubles I would get into if I tried to answer and give my own personal view on that, and I would certainly echo the minister by saying I think every single country would take your model and they would look at what would this mean in terms of my tax base, who would lose out, who would win, and so, well, if you have devised a tax model where everyone would win, that would
implement it right now.
Then could you send me something before 5? Because that would be interesting. No, I recognize the elegance of the three channels, but I think every single country, including the OECD member countries, would take a very careful look at how this would measure up against the status quo, and I think their opinions would be formed on that basis.
All right, we've got 2 minutes. I'm going to squeeze in one last cheeky question. Oh, 1 minute. Very quick question from the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. So I'm going to squeeze 2 questions in one. I'm going to try. So how it works is that what we see now is that with the rise of globalization and now digitalization has exacerbated the sort of tensions in globalization with regard to the tax base and base erosion and profit shifting. There have been talk that there should be a scrapping of the whole system. So you reform the entire global tax treaty system. So I'd just like to ask the views of the panelists about scrapping the entire treaty system and to create a new type of system. So my second question is also about...
I'm going to have to leave it to one question, sorry. Apologies. We've just got time for that last one. So about scrapping the global tax system.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure we can scrap the whole entire system of tax treaties, but what we are contemplating here and what we are looking at here is something that's only perhaps a little bit short of a revolution of the international tax system. I would definitely say that if we come up here at the OECD with a kind of agreement that is in the making right now, it will be, if not revolutionary, then it will certainly be a historic step forward in international cooperation on tax. Not scrapping everything, but certainly it'll certainly be a new system.
Keeping an open mind, being creative when it comes to these modern day solutions. All right, thank you very much, panelists. This was a wonderful discussion, and hopefully all of you enjoyed the discussion as well. I'm told that we have to swiftly move on, so thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.